stories for themselves. But it now gives me great pleasure to, as you can see, Anne sitting there, she's back in Bosnia, back with Hasan. And Professor Ann Petrila is a professor of the practice and the coordination of global initiatives and director of Global Practice Bosnia at the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work. Anne is co-author with Hasan of Voices from Srebrenica, Survivor Narratives of the Bosnian Genocide. Her areas of expertise include global cultural perspectives, trauma and genocide awareness, training, and every summer she leads an experiential Bosnia-based course and internship program for University of Denver graduate students. She has taken close to 300 university students to Bosnia, and she is dedicated to raising awareness and telling the truth about the genocide in Bosnia. And we're really looking forward to hearing your journey and your story of the story.
Maureen, thank you so much. I am so honored to be here tonight and so thrilled for a couple of reasons. One, Maureen, you and your colleagues have been so gracious and interested in hosting this. And Robert, to be on this panel with you and hear your story of your work told with such compassion and care and actual tenderness. It was really very, very moving. And above all, though, I have to say, as Maureen said, I'm sitting here in Srebrenica, which is long overdue, was unable to come, of course, last year. And through my friend here, Hasan, was able to come now for this. And so to be talking about this book in Srebrenica, sitting actually in the same room with Hasan, is quite remarkable. And he talked quite a bit actually about how this got started and our journey and our struggles. But I would like to do the same from my perspective, because I was so honored to do this, and I also struggled to do this as somebody who is not Bosnian and whose story it isn't. So I would like to add to what Hasan said, and perhaps some other details as well. And so I remember very clearly in 1995, on July 13th, I was driving actually to teach a course at the Graduate School of Social Work, and I was listening to National Public Radio. And the host was talking about reports that were coming out of Bosnia and a place called Srebrenica, and focusing on the unknown fate of thousands of men and boys who had gone missing. And so the first time I remember hearing about that, and now this many years later, I no longer have to wonder what it was about or if those men and boys were ever found, because I now have this incredible privilege of calling Bosnia a second home. And I know all too well what happened here, where I'm actually sitting in Srebrenica. And it's a horrifying story, but it's one that we all need to hear. And there's no better way to hear it than from those who survived it. We had the chance to hear from Hasan initially. I always do better actually when I go before Hasan, because I get pretty emotional listening to my friend here talk about this. So so bear with me. So the first time I came to Srebrenica, actually, I was with Bosnian friends, and they'd never been here before. And that day we met a Bosnian man who just started working at the Memorial Center as a curator. It was, I think, first early days of working there, and he'd survived the genocide, and he spent his days telling this story of what happened in his own story. And his name was Hasan Hasanović. And at the time, of course, I couldn't know that he would become a colleague and a dear friend and a partner in writing this book. And I'd been bringing students to Bosnia for many summers, and we would always come over here to Srebrenica, and Hasan was always our teacher. And I realized, though, that I had learned as much as I could on my own, I felt like, about the war and the genocide. And I asked him if he could recommend a good book for me to learn more about what had happened. And he said that that book didn't exist, and it certainly didn't exist in English. And then he made an amazing offer and said that if I could find a way to spend a few weeks over here, he would teach me everything that he could. And I am delighted to say that I figured out how to do that. And it was truly one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. And then a short time after that, Hasan invited me to join him on this day that he has described with the mothers who visit these main execution sites. And they go there to memorialize them, with prayers and flowers and remembrance. And we went to the main sites, which include a warehouse, fields, schools, a large dam, and a cultural center. And they're very difficult to find. And I was really struck by the fact that there was no marker on any of them about that it was an execution site. And it seemed to me like we were going in circles and backtracking. And Hasan told me that actually we were, because we were going to the sites in the order of the executions, the timing of them. And as you can imagine, these sites, these visits with these women, it was excruciating for them. Their husbands and fathers and brothers and sons and other male relatives had been executed there. And it was a time for me where I was in the presence of such raw and unimaginable grief. And I felt so honored to be there, but I wasn't sure it was my place to be there. And it's a question I asked myself countless times in Bosnia of, should I be here in such intimate moments in a culture that is not my own? And I think that questioning how to ethically work in cultures that are not our own is something that should never stop. We need to continue to do that. And we listened to a young man named Nejad, who we've heard about now from both of our speakers. And he was talking about his survival in a school where he'd been imprisoned, and at the dam where he was only one of 2 survivors out of 1,500 who were executed there. And I began to think about how his story and other stories of survival really could only be heard by those who were fortunate enough to spend time in Srebrenica. And Hasan mentioned then we made our last stop at the Pilica Cultural Center where his father was killed. And I just want to take a minute to describe what this place is like. And to me, it's the worst place that I have ever been in my life. And it's Robert so generously held up our book, and the cover of the book is of this inside of this cultural center. And to me, it's like a horror slasher film set, except it's real, and it truly feels haunted. And Hasan described the stage where these 500 men and boys tried to hide under there, and it was impossible. And you can truly still feel the fear in this building. And there were no survivors, as he said. And that was the day that we decided to try to preserve these stories of people who survived and those who didn't, in a way that could reach a larger audience if possible, because there are so many people who know so little about Bosnia or have never even heard of Srebrenica. So Hasan said that was the beginning of our journey, and it took us, he said 5 years, and I'm going to actually correct him and say 5.5 years from start to finish, if I may. See, he didn't remember that end part, Maureen, because he was with you when I was stalking him in Scotland. But we originally started out with one plan, as he said, and then we realized we needed to change it. And we all along wanted to write about this survivors' experiences using their own words and their own narratives if they were interested. And again, in English, you wanted to do it in English in a way that it could reach beyond Bosnia if people were wanting to do that. And as we expanded our idea, we kept adding more people who we thought might be interested in. Hasan already said that when the suggestion to go to Belgrade came up, I said we didn't have any more room. And I actually said that every time he made a suggestion of adding more people. And then I would say we didn't have room, and then we'd talk about it. And then I would say, I agree, yes, we should do it. And he was always right. Those were best decisions to keep adding more people. So again, I guess I want to just reflect a minute on that. When we were first started talking about writing it, I was so honored that Hasan wanted to do it together, because it's his country and his culture and his story. Yet he invited me to partner with him to do it, and I felt this great responsibility to get it right. And we did our best to do so. And I started just trying to sort it all out, and my head was sort of spinning around and thinking about the ethics and all of the things that we needed to do. And in the meantime, Hasan had already gotten on the phone, as he said, and contacted all of the people who he thought that we should interview. And he wasn't surprised that they all said yes, but I guess I was surprised. And but I shouldn't have been surprised, because they trusted Hasan, as he said, without exception. And by extension, they then trusted me. So they agreed to meet with us. And they, people were so clear that they wanted to tell us their stories and wanted us to record their stories. And at the beginning, several of the people actually were protected witnesses at the Hague Tribunal and asked us not to use their name. But by the time we published or came close to publication, they said that they actually wanted us to use their name because they wanted their stories to be recorded. And it was very, very hard for people to tell these stories, as you can imagine. And Hasan talked about his own journey with how hard it was to hear these stories. And we always gave people multiple options to stop. And we would pause, but they all wanted to continue in spite of how hard it was for them. And that just shows how much they wanted the truth to be recognized. So, and we met all over the place. We met with people in their homes and cafes and parks, wherever they wanted to meet. That was, of course, up to them. And we recorded the interviews, and Hasan mentioned he translated those that were conducted in Bosnian. And we ended up with hundreds and hundreds of pages of transcripts that had to be turned into chapters, and across the miles and across the languages, and with computers that didn't necessarily talk to each other, and which is part of why the journey became so long. But I really wanted to, again, do our best to tell these stories in a way that people who read about, the readers would care about the people they were reading about, because I knew it wasn't okay to just write about the tragic part of their lives for a couple of reasons. One is that it's barely tolerable to read about one atrocity after another. But most importantly, it's not fair to these incredible people. And so they are so much more than their tragedy is. So we really did our best to try to learn about their lives before the war and what they thought they wanted to be when they grew up and all sorts of things like that. But for many of them, it was seemingly impossible to talk about much other than the genocide and their sorrow. So I think we succeeded in presenting narratives, though, that not only include tragedy and sorrow, but also their senses of humor and their generosity, hopes and dreams, and determination and resilience. Hasan already mentioned then about going to Serbia, and I will just say, he said he had the idea we needed to go to Serbia, but actually the idea was I needed to go to Serbia. And I said I wasn't going without him, because he's the reason that people talk to us. And that, so therefore, if we wanted to do this, he needed to come, or we shouldn't do it. And then he, again, talked about his own way of sorting out how he decided to do that. And it truly turned out to be an amazing experience, and also gave us the perspective in the book that we wouldn't have otherwise. So we have included the personal narratives. We've included enough history, I hope, to provide context for the stories, looked at the verdicts from the ICTY, the psychological ramifications of intense individual, cumulative, and collective trauma, including organized and pervasive sexual violence, primarily against women, and the responsibility of the international community, in particular, the United Nations. And in closing, I just would like to say that it was also very important for us to include lessons learned from Bosnia in this book, because what happened here in Bosnia can happen anywhere. And the role that nationalism and propaganda, media control, assaults on the press, and a pervasive system of lies and dehumanizing language stoked such hatred that thousands of people were convinced to slaughter thousands of their neighbors and fellow citizens. And genocide just doesn't suddenly happen. All genocides follow the same stages, and they all include these things that we just mentioned. And it's crucial for each of us to pay close attention when hate-based, dehumanizing language riles people up in a dangerous way, and to things like Muslim bans and other policies designed to denigrate a particular group of people. Not to mention the intentionally false information being delivered as factual news. Over the past 4 years, and including now in my own country, in the States, we've seen the direct connection between dehumanizing language and violence against people based on their identities. We continue to see the danger of revisionist history. And not only do we need to pay attention, but we each need to figure out what our responsibility for addressing human rights violations is in some way as soon as they begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you, Hasan, also.